Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri, USPIE's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I'm your host, Sheri, and I have a great show for you. Joining me today is fellow board member of United States Parents Involved in Education, Melanie Kurdys, president of USPIE's chapter in the state of Michigan. I created this podcast to engage with people from around the country who want to return America's education to its proper local roots and restore parental authority over their children's education. I believe the time is right for massive change. Serious conversations are happening throughout the country about the legitimate and effective role of the federal government in education. Many on both sides of the political aisle agree the federal government has become unreasonably intrusive and ineffective in education policy and practice. In 2017, Representative Thomas Massie sponsored H.R. 899, a simple statement to close the Federal Department of Education, starting an important national conversation. That same year, USPIE published a blueprint describing the steps needed to close the Federal Department of Education. Then in 2023, USPIE published another blueprint. This one focused on helping states eliminate federal influence in education. Now President Trump has vowed to close the U.S. Department of Education. He's going to do it very early in his administration, he said, sending all education and education work and the needs back to the states. USPIE is working to develop federal and state legislation to do just that. Melanie will be discussing this in some detail. Before I bring her on, do me a favor and give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit uspie.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. Parents Involved in Education. USPIE's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. My guest today is Melanie Kurdys. Melanie is an accomplished business person, an educator and researcher, an education activist, and a mother of 3 adult children. And her grandchildren, she has 8 of them. Her mathematics degree from the University of Michigan enabled her to work for IBM, AT&T, and Authur Young, among others. Melanie was also an active school volunteer, in-school math tutor in Louisiana, California, Georgia, and Michigan. She was elected to her local school board and ran for Michigan State Board of Education in 2012. As co-founder of Stop Common Core in Michigan, Melanie continues to be a volunteer education advocate for parents, teachers, and importantly, kids. I'll be back with my interview with Melanie Kurdys right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education has developed a transformative initiative, the Blueprint to Establish State Control of Education, which outlines the gradual elimination of all federal education dollars. Last week, we addressed the first 2 steps, calculating federal spending in your state and conducting a cost of compliance study. Today, we unfold steps 3 and 4. Step 3. Identify and eliminate programs lacking effectiveness, necessity, or efficiency. Strategically replace them with state-centric alternatives, unbound by external scrutiny. Step 4. Redirect education revenue responsibilities back to the state. Instead of channeling state taxpayer funds to the federal government only to receive them with strings attached, the Blueprint provides tax strategies to retain these funds within the state. For further insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, visit uspie.org or connect with us at USPIE on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I am your host, Sheri, and today I have with me my friend and fellow USPIE board member, Melanie Kurdys. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Sheri.
Oh, absolutely. The intro, I shared a few, highlights from your career with our listeners, so much which brings you bring to USPIE. And I'm so thankful that you are a partner and a true warrior in this battle. And let me just add for our viewers that you are also the chairman of the research committee who developed the blueprints that we're going to be talking about, and you're working on a new report. So you've been very vital to USPIE and our mission, and I really appreciate you, Melanie.
Well, I'm honored to be part of USPIE. The organization's mission is exactly what I'm committed to, returning control to parents, because we know that that's the best way that children can be educated by the people who love them the most.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and we're so blessed to have you on the team, Melanie. Well, let's dive into what I want to discuss today, namely the two white papers USPIE has produced. One is our blueprint, to close the U.S. Department of Education, and the other, a blueprint to establish state control of education. So, how are these different and how are they related, Melanie?
Well, you introduced the blueprints in the terms of the timing that we developed them, and rightly so, because when Thomas Massie put out his bill to close the Department of Education, it was under Trump's first administration, and he had mentioned that he was interested. And we saw it as an opportunity that if we could devise a simple, straightforward strategy that they could follow, it would put meat on the bone, so to speak, of Thomas Massie's bill. But then the political winds changed, and it was clear that the Biden administration was not interested in closing the federal Department of Education or returning control to the states. And in fact, they were onerous in their use of funding to put additional pressures on schools to institute programs like diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, and those programs. So we saw many governors trying to control education within their state. And so we devised a plan when we realized that only about 10% of education funding comes from the federal government into most states. And so we again went to work on developing a clear, clean, easy process to follow for a state to wean themselves from federal intrusion. So the idea is that the ultimate fix is that both things happen, that the federal government gets rid of education funding influence completely, and that the states take over control within themselves. And then you mentioned the third piece, which we're talking about, and that is helping states refine what they're doing to maximize parental control. And because that's really where the power of returning education will come from.
Well, I couldn't agree more. So let's talk a little bit about the steps in the blueprint. And of course, you and I have been talking about, and our board has been talking about trying to get the first blueprint to close the U.S. Department of Education into hands of the Trump administration and those who are going to be working on fulfilling his campaign promise to close the U.S. Department of Education. So let's talk a little bit about what our blueprint says can be done. And let's start with the blueprint to close U.S. Ed.
So one of the concerns we have is the rumors during Trump's first administration were that they would move functions of the U.S. Department of Education to other departments and then just close the federal Department of Education. This is not what our vision is. Our vision is that the federal government gets out of education influence completely. As a matter of fact, I just heard about a new grant that had been offered by the Health and Human Services Department to try to influence schools, as grants to the schools. So these kinds of things should all become illegal and not allowed. So, but the steps are, there's 5 of them. So to send all the programs and the program funding back to the states, to repeal all the laws that are related to K-12 education, starting with the Every Student Succeeds Act, to privatize college loan programs through savings and loan institution, to eliminate the offices and divisions of the U.S. Department of Ed and related spending. So again, there's 2 others, the Department of Health and Human Services, that administers programs, and the agriculture department that actually administers the free and reduced lunch. Because as we saw under the Biden administration, the free and reduced lunch funding was used to influence schools to allow boys to use girls' bathrooms. So it's very influential policy coming from a nominal amount of money. And then finally, to reduce the federal tax collection and shift the education revenue responsibility entirely back to the states. So the whole idea that the federal government takes our money through income tax and other tax systems and then pays a bunch of bureaucrats to devise a program with a bunch of strings attached and sends it back to us to tell us how to educate our children. And it only amounts to 10% coming back to us. And we think that in the end, if they shift this around, that states will save money. Well, and clearly the federal government will be reduced spending. So we think this fits with the Trump administration, both in terms of giving control back to parents and also reducing the size and scope of federal government.
Well, that was an excellent explanation. I appreciate that. So, often when I'm talking about the need to close the U.S. Department of Education, I tell people that we understand, and the reason we made this our mission is we understand that that's where the majority of the nefarious pedagogies originate. And they're incentivized with federal dollars, just like you were talking about. There are tons of grants through lots of federal agencies, and we know that schools will do all they can to get more money, and so they're applying for these grants, and in order to receive them, to be competitive in the grant process, they have to agree to do certain things. And so that's just a little background for the viewers to understand why this is so important. Not only is it unconstitutional, of course, for the federal government to be involved in education, it is extremely expensive, as you've pointed out. Sending our money to DC and they send it back pennies with strings attached, telling us again how to educate our children. So thanks for explaining that. So you want to just go briefly then over the other blueprint to establish state control of education?
So it has 4 steps. First, we recommend that the states analyze their funds by source, federal, state, and local. We found a really good website, usgovernmentspending.com, that can be structured so that you can see just your state information split exactly this way. And it shows that for most states, the 10-year average is around 10% of their overall education budget coming from federal resources. So once you can see that, you can help open the conversation with the public and other legislators about how 10%, the dollars might be large, but 10% is a reasonable shift. Then we talk about doing what we call a cost of compliance study. So this is the step where you look at programs where, let's say you're getting a lot of funding for Head Start. Then you would want to look through and see how much is Head Start costing you to administer, and compare that. I'm pretty sure all the states have their own preschool program, and compare the cost structure of your state program. We have a think tank in Michigan that did that for us, and clearly the state program is much more efficient and effective. So you do this for all your major areas that you get funding, and you begin to see that you can offset what you're getting from the feds in terms of the cost to administer all the reporting, plus the other strings of things you have to do that maybe you don't want to do. And you can see that, again, it'll be less than the 10% in terms of value, for sure. We talked to Neil McCluskey at Cato, and he said he wished somebody would actually do this kind of thing overall, and we hadn't done yet. So we're still working with a couple states that are interested, but his guess, it could be 60% of what you use, 40% to administer and 60% for dollars, and even that might be optimistic. So this is a really important step to help build political will, to help people understand you're not really losing out by taking control back. And then you identify the state programs that you can use to replace USED. Like, for example, I said Head Start, you would use your state program. your free and reduced lunch. You might want to allow individual schools to come up with their own plans. We have some examples in the blueprint of school districts that have done that. Or you might develop a state program that does that sort of thing. And then you can gradually, program by program, shift the responsibilities back to the state. And then the last step is trying to, again, figure out how to get the federal government to not take your tax money in the first place. So we used to have a deduction for a SALT tax deduction, the state and local tax deduction. They did away with that because it appeared that the Democrat states were benefiting from that. But it seems to me one for education might come back as a positive opportunity, that if a state wants to take responsibility for all their education funding, they have to institute a tax for education purposes, and then the taxpayers do not pay that to the federal government. So you don't even send them the money in the first place, which is the best solution.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I just have to compliment you, Melanie, on your brilliance in these topics. As you're explaining it, I've explained it many times, but you're the one that developed the original plan, you and your committee. And it sounds so simple. And really it is, isn't it? It doesn't have to be complicated. The Department of Education, now has an $80 billion budget annually. And people just look at that and think it's just impossible. I mean, where would you start? But it doesn't have to be complicated. And you've done an excellent job of explaining it. So now there's another report you're working on regarding a question that is being debated a lot these days. And that is whether the government schools are actually redeemable. During his campaign, President Trump said, "We owe our children great schools that lead to great jobs." And he listed 10 ideas for transforming American education. I want you to listen to his remarks and give me your thoughts on a couple of those ideas.
Here are 10 key ideas that will power our movement for great schools. First, we will respect the right of parents to control the education of their children. Second, we will empower parents and local school board to hire and reward great principals and teachers, and also to fire the poor ones, the one whose performance is unsatisfactory. They will be fired. Like on The Apprentice, you're fired. Third, we will ensure our classrooms are focused not on political indoctrination, but on teaching the knowledge and skills needed to succeed: reading, writing, math, science, arithmetic, and other truly useful subjects. Fourth, we will teach students to love their country, not to hate their country like they're taught right now. Fifth, we will support bringing back prayer to our schools. Sixth, we will achieve schools that are safe, secure, and drug-free, with immediate expulsion for any student who harms a teacher or another student. Seventh, we will give all parents the right to choose another school for their children if they want. It's called school choice. Eighth, we will ensure students have access to project-based learning experiences inside the classroom to help train them for meaningful work outside the classroom. Ninth, we will strive to give all students access to internships and work experiences that can set them on a path to their first job. They're going to be very, very successful. I want them to be more successful than Trump. Let them go out and be more successful. I will be the happiest person in the world. But we want our children to have a great life and be successful. And 10th, we will ensure that all schools provide excellent jobs and career counseling so that high school and college students can get a head start on jobs and careers best suited to their God-given talents. This is how we will ensure a great education for every American child. And one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it.
There's a lot there, but I want to ask you more generally. What are your thoughts on whether the new administration will actually bring significant change to American education? And tell us about the new report you're working on.
Okay. So President Trump has great vision and great ideas. He started with respecting parental control and empowering parents and local authorities. These are really important items. The problem is, if the federal government relinquishes control, then his ability to directly influence things is reduced. And so that's going to be the trick to help them understand. For example, there was he suggests ensure classrooms are focused on reading, writing, and mathematics and not political. The problem we have is we have a huge installed base of teachers who have not been taught well how to teach reading, writing, and math, who have been indoctrinated themselves to believe things like critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion, and that they're good things. And so at their core, they are not able to execute this vision that President Trump is talking about. And so he does talk about empowering to hire and fire, perhaps through labor law. They can generally provide some ability and flexibility to do that. But this is where we have leaned into the idea that it's better to pull your kids out of public school until that problem is fixed, and homeschool and private school. So one of the other items that President Trump talked about is parental school choice. Now, in our opinion, parents already had school choice. It's legal to homeschool in every state. It's legal to send your children to a private school that takes no government money. So you already have this choice. Then within the public school arena, you can send your child to a charter school. And in many states, you can send your child to a neighboring school district. So there is choice now. The question is, who pays for it? And the problem is that, whoever pays, whoever owns the gold, sets the rules, or whatever the old saying is. And so the minute you start taking government money for homeschooling and private schooling is when the government can and will institute regulations. Both parties do it. And it's been judged by the Supreme Court that it is right, that the government has the right to regulate funds that it distributes. So the only way you keep real educational freedom and choice in place is to have options for parents that do not take government money, that they manage completely on their own. And so protecting those rights is the avenue. And you don't do it by funding, you do it by court cases that are found in favor of parents' rights. It's a tricky balance. I'm not sure President Trump has thought through the relationship between closing the Department of Education and then instituting his other ideas. So that's a conversation we hope to have, maybe with the new Secretary of Education. And that would be great if we could get audience there.
Right. You make such a great point there. And that's what people aren't thinking about. His 10-point plan, all sounds wonderful. It's all the things we want as conservatives. We want the Bible back in school and prayer back in school. I mean, we want those things. But as you pointed out to me in a conversation we had about this, you can't do that if you're going to fulfill the idea of returning local control. You can't be telling local schools what they can and cannot teach and can and cannot do. So if we're going to sincerely return local control, parental and local control, then we can't have the federal government dictating what happens in the classroom. But there are other creative ways that the president could influence the decisions being made. And there was one in particular you mentioned about the Bible. You want to tell the viewers about that?
We have a couple states that are instituting the use of the Bible in school as a historical document, which is appropriate because our country was founded on biblical values. I mean, the Ten Commandments is just a simple example. And the country was not founded on other religious books like the Quran, for example. And so introducing the Bible back in as a historic document that is relevant makes sense. It's proper education, and it should be protected. And now the way President Trump can help here is in those court cases that are happening now where people are suing about bringing the Bible back and trying to challenge those laws. His Department of Justice could support the using of the Bible in this way. So this is not using money to bribe schools or influence schools. This is using the power of the bully pulpit and the power of the justice system to institute what is right for the schools to be able to do. So those kinds of actions where his Justice Department stands behind schools that are making good choices, that would be very helpful.
I agree, and that's a great analogy or an example for our listeners to understand how he can be influential and achieve part of his plan, but not doing it through using the federal government and the federal funding as a hammer to force states to do what they want.
Yeah, if you recall, President Reagan ran on closing the Federal Department of Education, and his Department of Education secretary talked him out of it, saying, well, if Republicans are in control, we should be able to do it better. The problem is it's not true. It's one of those faulty thoughts that kind of follow socialism. That is, that central planning would work if good people are doing the central planning. Some things cannot be well central planned. Education is one of them. Education is a very personal issue. Every child is different. The relationship between children and their teachers, whether their teachers are their parents or other people, is very personal. You cannot manage education in a central planning arena. I mean, every parent knows children learn to walk at a different pace. You can't say all children must be walking by the time they're 1 year old. you can use it as a guideline because it's appropriate, and some children will walk sooner and some children will walk later. None of those children are necessarily broken, but you do know that if the child's not walking by the time they're 1.5 years, that you probably want to get a doctor involved to figure out if there's some structural issue that needs to be handled. So parents know this intuitively about their children. So arbitrary guidelines or curriculum and standards and assessments that are set at some central level, it's very hard to make them appropriate for all children. And so it's just, it doesn't matter who's in charge, because the whole concept of central planning education is a flawed concept.
Very good. Very well explained. Thank you. So we're going to take a quick break, but when I come back, I want to talk about some of the problems with the topic known as school choice. Now, you touched on it just a little bit a minute ago, but we're going to talk about it some more. So don't go away. We'll be right back. U.S. Parents Involved in Education developed the game-changing Blueprint to Establish State Control of Education, a visionary initiative that aims to restore state sovereignty, enhance student learning, and safeguard parental rights. But developing the political will to make this happen is critical. Washington's growing demand for control dwarfs its actual funding while generating bureaucracies that suppress local innovation. Parents and teachers are frustrated by regulations that hinder problem solving, and state education officials report that many staff members primarily manage federal programs. By following the USPIE blueprint, state leaders will be empowered to make strong cases to decision makers, educators, and parents to eliminate reliance on federal funding, reclaim control, and foster education excellence. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, and connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I am your host, Sheri Few. I'm here with Melanie Kurdys, and we're discussing the question of school choice. What are some of the misconceptions people have about this topic, Melanie?
Okay, so first I want to reiterate a point I made earlier, and that is that parents already have school choice. Homeschooling is legal in every state in the United States. We have private schools in every state. We have public schools, and most states have extensive charter school options. So you have choice. The question isn't the choice, it's who pays for it. People say, well, I pay my taxes into the public school. If I want to choose something else, the tax money should go to that something else. Let's think about some other examples of things you pay for that you don't use. A lot of people live in an area where they pay for mass transit, but they drive their own car. That's a choice you make. Now, you could make the argument that if you pay into mass transit, you're paying for transit. The government should provide you money to buy your own car if that's what you'd rather do. That's your choice. But the problem is, they could give you the money and then tell you, well, you can only have a car that's electric and goes 50 miles on a charge and carries two people and has a little area for groceries. I mean, they get to define the rules of what it is you buy. So that would not be an amenable solution for most parents or most taxpayers. And I think people misinterpret the whole idea of school choice and school funding and don't consider the implications of directing government money to private choices.
And of course, we know that that can be dangerous. The precedent has already been set, as you've reminded me, and we mentioned in some of our position statements with Hillsdale College. So talk a little bit about that. How we already know that if schools take government money, they will be subject to regulation.
A lot of people know Hillsdale College doesn't take any government money at all, and they don't even allow their students to take government loans or grants or scholarships. And the reason is, back in the late 70s and early 80s, Hillsdale allowed some students in on Pell Grants. And it was a small number of students. But after they did that, the government showed up with their clipboards and started asking questions and wanting them to collect information like, how many minority teachers do you have? How many minority students do you have? And Hillsdale didn't gather that data because they didn't think it was relevant to student achievement or quality of teaching. And so they took it to court, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they lost. And the Supreme Court ruled that when the government provides the funding, they have the right to regulate. And both parties regulate. The Democrats do it, the Republicans do it. And the evidence from Cato Institute research is that the more popular a program is, the more it's regulated. And regulation increases over time. And that even if you institute a program with very little regulation at the beginning, that as it's popular, as it's aged, as it expands, regulation increases. So we know it to be true. This is not something that's a hypothetical.
Right. And so that's what we've been warning people, because we know that the school choice movement is rampant across the country because parents are so fed up with the indoctrination that's happening in government schools. So the Republican Party has always thought that school choice was the silver bullet to cure all the ills in government schools. So we see these bills, and some have passed. We've got universal school choice in Arizona. I think there's a couple other states that are considering it or already have it. And so it seems to be very popular among parents who are frustrated. And we have been warning them. We've been trying to sound the alarm. This is not a good idea, because if private schools and homeschoolers start taking government money, as you pointed out, if it doesn't look like it's regulated now, it will be eventually, and it will increase over time. It can destroy government schools. And I think the leftists that really run the government education system currently and have for some time, they would want nothing more than to control all education, including private and homeschools. So that's why it's a slippery slope. It's not a good idea. And that's why we've recommended tax credits instead, an income tax credit on the state and federal level. You want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, so it is the style of USPIE to not just complain, but to try to devise a workable solution. And we thought about the whole point of when you fill out your income taxes, there's a line that is a deduction, a child credit, a child tax deduction for every child that you have. And the idea of that money is money you keep, you earned it, you keep it to raise your children. Now, there's no strings on that money. It's your money in the first place. It's never taxed. It never went to the government. You're keeping it. There's no regulation about that money. So if we added a box on the income tax that said my children do not attend public school, that's all you have to say, then you get more money. And then that would be a way to redirect tax money back to parents who are making a choice outside of the public school system. And that would be fair. And the way the government could double check that there's not cheating is to do a check of the social security numbers of the children who are claimed to not go to public school to the list of students who do go to school, to make sure that nobody's trying to game the system and do both. And this way, if states move toward really funding public schools based on enrollment, the tax demands on the public school should go down, because if more parents are making choices to take their kids out of public schools and you have fewer students there, public schools should get smaller, have lower revenue, and in essence, the whole program, the whole taxing system should shuffle down and shuffle over toward the choice mechanism.
Yes, and the other thing that we've talked about before, and we've tried to explain to people, is that with the new education savings accounts or vouchers, whatever you want to call them, what we're actually doing is funding two systems. So it's actually increased spending, and even if we were to take that money from the local district where the taxpayers are claiming it on their income tax, you know that the local school districts aren't going to reduce their budget accordingly. So it's really an increase in spending, funding two systems. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's right. And if we're looking at trying to reduce government, and really it's appropriate that if children are not entering the public school to be educated, that system should have a reduced funding. So the ESAs and voucher programs offer no strategy for making that happen. And so that's why our approach is very comprehensive, looking to not just facilitate choice for parents and perhaps some money opportunities, but also to reduce the overall tax burden as a result.
Before we end our time, I'd like you to share with our listeners some of the things you're optimistic about, Melanie, and maybe some of your concerns.
My optimism is that the momentum is clearly in support of our vision of education. I am just overwhelmed how often I hear people recognizing that the current public education system is failing our kids, that we need something different. The momentum to pulling children out of government schools, that you see it on Facebook, on Twitter. I mean, the social media is just full of it. And so it's very exciting that people are seeing the opportunity to that the importance of doing this well, and the opportunity that Trump administration offers to make something different happen. My concern is that it is human nature to want to control things, and a many will react to our vision of education being primarily driven by parents as mass confusion, the possibility of insane things happening, because it'll be not just 50 different ways of educating children, but 5 million different ways of educating children, as if that's a problem. But I think the current homeschool outcomes and the current private school outcomes really help tell the story that it isn't that way. Parents really do want their children to know how to read, write, and do math. We had a court case here in Michigan where the parents sued the school district because their children graduated with a diploma and they couldn't read or write at the 8th grade level. They sued. It went to the Michigan Supreme Court, and the parents lost, because the Supreme Court of Michigan said our Constitution calls for having a public school system, but there's no requirement for quality. And so you see the commitment to quality is by parents. And maybe all parents don't feel comfortable with the idea of homeschooling, but we have homeschool co-ops. We have the Homeschool Legal Defense Association that has all kinds of programs to help parents. There are organizations within each state that help parents work together to do homeschooling. There are good, solid Christian and Catholic private schools, classical models that are really good places that offer scholarships and other means for families who need help to participate. So I hope we can overcome the Congress, the legislator, the ruling class inclination to not trust us to do a good job of educating our own children. That they can let go of the fake fallen idea that they can do it better, because we have years of evidence that they can't, that this system isn't working. And so we're not going to do it worse. There's no indication that a whole city of children like Detroit won't know how to read as a result of shifting this responsibility back to parents. So as I'm optimistic, but it's a little worrisome to me, because it just defies human nature of leaders who've been used to a certain way.
Well, that was very well said, Melanie. And I know you and I have had conversations about some of the bills we've been trying to help craft in some of the states, in my state in particular, where we have a tax credit bill. And the senator who sponsored the bill was debating me about how he felt we had to have some form of accountability for these parents receiving tax credits. And that's when you made the point that you just made so well about, the current government school system certainly is not being held accountable for not educating children, not teaching them how to read, write, and do math. So again, that's the biggest argument I think I hear. And that's even from our side, because that's the pushback they're getting from the education establishment and the left. They're saying there's got to be some accountability. Well, it's high time we held the government schools accountable for not educating our children and indoctrinating them instead. So this has been a really great conversation. I thank you so much for being on the show and for everything you do for USPIE.
Thank you very much, Sheri. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to work with you in this very important mission we have.
Okay, well, thank you, Melanie. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.